Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the reading of tributes of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I'm Billy Chen, president of the Academy. Since 1903, the Academy has presented tributes to members who have passed away. These are typically read at our headquarters building in New York City before our spring and fall dinners. Now, because of the pandemic, we're presenting tributes virtually as live readings on Zoom. Tonight, we will be reading tributes to 4 Academy members: the writer, Russell Baker, the architect, César Pelli, the composer, Christopher Rouse, and the artist, Robert Ryman. These are being recorded and will be posted on our website in a few days. To begin, writer and Academy member Calvin Trillin will read the tribute to Russell Baker.
When Russell Baker was asked how he happened to become a New York Times columnist, he sometimes said that when he was a reporter covering Congress for the Times, he spent a lot of time sitting on the marble floor outside an executive session of some congressional committee, waiting for congressmen to come out and lie to him. Russell would know that the congressmen were lying, and the congressmen would know that Russell knew they were lying. And Russell would know that the congressman knew Russell knew that they were lying. Furthermore, Russell said, having grown up partly in Baltimore, where neighbors were accustomed to sitting on those iconic Baltimore marble stoops while passing the time of day, he knew that too much sitting on marble could give you piles. So Russell decided he'd rather be a columnist than a reporter. Having heard Russell tell that story, I would not advise taking it literally. It was more in the spirit of a column he once wrote that began, when Francisco Franco died, he went to the New York Department of Motor Vehicles. Whatever tale he spun about how his role at the Times came about, the simple fact is that Russell Baker was born to be a newspaper columnist. It's not that he didn't excel in aspects of the trade other than column writing. His memoir of a Depression-era childhood, Growing Up, won the Pulitzer Prize for biography, adding to the Pulitzer he had already won for commentary. By the time he freed himself from that dangerous marble floor, he'd forged a highly successful career as a reporter. In the 90s, he became known to millions as the host of Masterpiece Theater. And after his retirement from the Times, he wrote insightful New York Review of Books essays that were not subject to those 800-word space constraints he'd faced in column writing, a calling he sometimes compared to doing ballet in a telephone booth. He did that ballet for 36 years. Russell's obituary in the Times said that he could be tongue-in-cheek one day and melancholy the next, then folksy, anguished, lyrical, or acid. A Times reader who turned to the column entitled Observer might read a fanciful tale about a man who woke up to find himself with someone else's feet, and he might read this dead serious description of Richard Nixon. There were darknesses in his soul that seemed to leave his life bereft of joy. He was a private, lonely man who never seemed comfortable with anyone, including himself, a man of monumental insecurities for whom public life, I thought, must be a constant ordeal. Whatever mode Russell was in, he preferred the unadorned to the gussied up. That was reflected in his own prose and in his comments on the tendency of Americans to write and speak the sort of English that turn use into utilize and do into implement. He called it fat English. Show them a lean, plain word that cuts to the bone, he wrote, and watch them lard it with thick, greasy syllables front and back until it wheezes and gasps for breath as it comes lumbering down upon some poor, threadbare sentence, like a sack of iron on a swayback horse. Russell was an enemy of pretension and pomposity. A genuinely modest man himself, he made light of politicians who go around the country boasting of their humility, and he resisted the tendency to remove the president from the lives of ordinary Americans. You can never see a president waiting in the rain at a bus stop, he wrote. After a while, presidents quite naturally forget that there are such things as bus stops. And if they stay in office long enough, they even forget that it rains. After Russell and his wife, Mimi, moved from Washington to New York in 1974, he wrote somewhat less about politics and politicians and somewhat more about the pleasures and perils, mostly perils, of the city. Once, while taking a walk near his apartment, he was barely missed by a raw potato that had apparently fallen from a tall building. But what if the potato had scored a direct hit with fatal consequences, he wrote. After a certain age, most people probably speculate occasionally on the manner of their ultimate departure, but the possibility of becoming a potato victim was one that had never occurred to me, and I did not like it. Even friends would find it hard to suppress private little smiles as they passed the news. Coming through a raw potato near miss intact had one advantage. It is such a rare event that the odds against being involved in two during one lifetime are overwhelming. Hence, it is close to certainty as possible that falling potato will not be the instrument of my farewell. After a dozen years in New York, Russell and Mimi moved to Loudoun County, Virginia, the county where he had spent his impoverished early years. Mimi died in 2015. She and Russell had been married for 65 years. Russell died in January of 2019 at age 93. His son Alan said there had been complications after a fall. Apparently, there was no potato involvement.
Thank you, Bud. Architect and Academy member Robert A.M. Stern will read the tribute to César Pelli.
In a time when too many architects are disruptive stars and promoted as such, César Pelli worked modestly and collaboratively to resolve the conflicts that are the bedrock of practice in order to renew architecture and contribute to its evolution. César Pelli was a master architect specializing in the design of skyscrapers, the single most potent and widely recognized symbol of American architecture, marrying romantic form to technological materialism. César was among the first in his generation to insist that being tall was not enough, that the tall office building needed to be more than a warehouse for workers with so many rentable floors of anonymous space, that skyscrapers needed to be memory towers. César Pelli was born in 1926 in Tucumán, a small provincial city in Argentina. After graduating from the National University of Tucumán, César and his new bride, Diana Balmori, emigrated to the United States, where he would spend 2 years at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, first as a postgraduate in architecture, followed by a year as a studio teacher, before going on to Birmingham, Michigan, to join the office of Eero Saarinen, the brilliant Yale-trained Finnish-American architect, then challenging the modernist hegemony with romantic, expressive work. Side by side with Kevin Roach, César quickly became an important member of Saarinen's design team, collaborating on two major projects: the TWA Flight Center at Kennedy Airport and two new residential colleges at Yale. Soon after Saarinen death in 1961, César relocated to Los Angeles, then considered to be an architectural backwater, concerned almost exclusively with the design of single-family houses on suburban lots, which were of little interest to him. Spending 10 years in Los Angeles, he joined two large corporate architectural offices in succession as a lead designer. Working for one of these firms, César catapulted to international prominence with the Pacific Design Center, an enormous warehouse-like structure sheathed in blue-tinted glass and shaped in such a way as to recall Sir Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace of 1851. In 1977, César returned to New Haven to take up the reins of the Yale School of Architecture, a move that many Los Angeles architects deemed a blow to their city's evolving architectural culture. As one critic put it, César was valued as, quote, a man of exceptional charm, poise, tact, and discretion, a man who disagrees without being disagreeable, one who takes firm stands without offending. Although held in high regard by many, César's selection for this important academic post in New Haven came as a surprise to some who were suspicious of his corporate architectural practice and his longtime residence in Los Angeles, then regarded as the edge of the earth. Nonetheless, under his direction, Yale School regained the lost momentum of the riotous late 1960s that had culminated in a disastrous 1969 fire in the recently completed Art and Architecture building. Although he exhibited a surprising tolerance for academic discourse, as dean, César never embraced it as a substitute for disciplinary skill, telling students that, quote, when artistic impulse is supported by, rather than runs counter to, the other realities of your program, you will be developing an architecture that will last. Perceived to be a committed modernist, as César Pelli rejected modernism's, as dean, César Pelli rejected modernism's belligerent disregard for history, making clear to students that, quote, no architect invents architecture. Learning from immediate precedent is critical. Enabling architecture to become a part of the historic continuum. When we design a building to be as fresh and new as possible, all we have really done is reinterpret ideas, thoughts, formal devices, and solutions that others, including perhaps ourselves, have used before. We give them a new twist or add a few new things, but most of that design comes from the past. Nobody can invent all that we need to solve the simplest problem in one lifetime. At first, César's move to Yale was intended to be a move away from professional practice, a way to experience what he described as, quote, another level of pressure, of excitement, of intellectual discipline that would be quite good. By coming to Yale, he intended to pursue an academic life, spent teaching and writing, but that was not to be. He was immediately immersed in private practice when he was asked to design an expansion to the Museum of Modern Art and to design its adjacent residential tower. After the MoMA commission, work began to snowball, including massive office buildings at the World Financial Center in New York, leading him to step down as Yale Dean in 1984. Asked to explain his decision, he confessed to no longer enjoying the challenge of running a school. Parenthetically, I can understand that completely. At the beginning of his time as dean, he stated, whenever we had a crisis, I loved it because this crisis is the best opportunity to make changes. But one day we had a crisis and I thought, oh my God, that's the last thing I need. While called on to design many different types of buildings, his signature accomplishment was as a poet of the skyscraper, rescuing this most American building type from the lackluster state in which it had fallen during the modernist collapse of the late 1960s. Working within the tradition of Raymond Hood, Harvey Wiley Corbett, and Hugh Ferris, César reimagined the skyscraper as crucial to a revived urbanism, rich with historical reference and detail. His World Financial Center in Lower Manhattan not only managed to wrestle the disruptive twin towers of the World Trade Center back into scale, but also to shape a major public space at its heart, the Winter Garden, a grandly proportioned steel and glass tribute to the concourse at Grand Central Terminal. Through his work, César Pelli made an entire generation that the skyscraper deserves its place. He made clear, that for an entire generation that the skyscraper deserves its place in the larger realm of a city and its culture. This was best exemplified by the twin Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur, completed in 1997, and until 2004, the world's tallest buildings. But the great accomplishment of this design was not its height, but its synthesis of advanced technology with a local Muslim vernacular. César Pelli was an architect who understood how to build big in cities without overturning their culture, character, and patterns of living. With his departure, the House of Architecture is substantially diminished.
Thank you, Bob. Composer and Academy member Robert Beaser will read the tribute to Christopher Rouse. Before he begins, we will play a brief clip of Christopher Rouse's Der gerettete Alberic.
With Christopher Rouse's passing in 2019, just a month before his Sixth Symphony received its premiere, the world lost a great composer. He was a dear friend and a powerful presence in my life for over 35 years. He carried the torch high. He reminded me of the responsibilities and fragilities of being a creative artist, and by example, shone a light on everyone around him. Although well-schooled in the standard isms of the 20th century, Chris was consumed by a more personal set of passions. Shostakovich, Led Zeppelin, Wagner, Little Richard. By embracing and building on these passions, he created works which rendered opposites of tonality and chromaticism, saturation and transparency, complexity and simplicity, into a crystallization of raw emotion. He taught the first course on the history of rock and roll at Eastman in the 80s, causing a stir among musicologists, and burst onto the new music scene with orchestral scores so loud that musicians' unions demanded earplugs and plastic barriers. His hometown Baltimore Symphony affectionately dubbed him Mr. Sunshine. Chris's career may have begun with the booming hammer of Thor, but it did not take him long to find far more subtle and complex tools. Rejecting the ironic detachment of postmodernism, he gravitated towards an art which, quote, has the power to present something meaningful to people about human experience. A relentless curiosity underpins a body of music which is unabashedly eclectic, urgent, and expressionistic, and whose goal is, above all, communication. When I came out to Aspen 16 years ago to join Chris as composer in residence at the Summer Music Festival, I visited him in his motel room, where he had set up his work area. He had never really learned to play any instruments well. He said that percussion was the one instrument he almost played. A tiny 2-octave Yamaha keyboard sat on a Formica dining room table with a pad of Aztec music paper and some sharpened pencils, situated strategically across from the television set, so that he could compose while watching the soaps. Chris always said that the orchestra was his real love, and his oeuvre shows it. His orchestral output vastly outweighed any other medium in his catalog. And from the triangle to the Mahler box, percussion commands center stage, deployed in his orchestrations as projectiles of devastating effect. But it is the musical arc itself, timed with uncanny surety, bubbling on the surface but seething under the hood, that delivers the knockout punch. We served together on the comm faculty for Juilliard over 20 years. Among the rites of passages for his students were Chris's diatribes against using digital metronome markings, his impatience with fuzzy and impractical notation, far-flung listening assignments, and the all-time fan-favorite demonstration on the proper etiquette for a stage bow. It was a very specific prescription. Chris would stand up and walk us through each move. And to this day, whenever I'm in front of an orchestra, I repeat those steps verbatim. At the Juilliard auditions, occasionally we would tag team together to interview prospective students. The two of us would thumb through their scores. Chris, with his Diet Coke in hand, would stroke his beard and with that devilish gleam in his eye, say something like, "So, what 19th century Scandinavian composers do you listen to?" After they fumbled around for a few seconds, he would mercifully rescue them with, "You really need to look at Johann Svensson's Norwegian Rhapsody No. 3. Number 3, mind you. I had barely myself heard of Johann Svensson, let alone listened to his Norwegian Rhapsody No. 3. However, Chris's encyclopedic brain had long ago devoured every work this man wrote. In fact, whenever discussing any composer, no matter how far afield, Chris was always dead sure of which pieces were their best, and it's safe to bet that they were usually the most obscure one. If Chris was an omnivore across time and space, the boldest of 20th century American music was at the core of his art, modeled in some ways from his early encounters with composer William Schumann, with whom Chris corresponded as a fledgling composer. Bill was generous in his correspondence with Chris, and Chris never forgot it. Schumann's music is sinewy, muscular, and Rouse's music is muscular and cinematic, and it is built kind of like the Largo Argentina in Rome, on archaeological layers of history. Each piece forms its own sui generis world. At first, Rouse used the Bible or Greek mythology as stepping-off points in works such as Gorgon, Phaeton, and Iscariot. Soon, he took people as stepping-off points. Deeply felt works in memory of Stephen Albert, Leonard Bernstein, Andrei Panufnik, and Schumann himself were part of the correspondences he carried on with composers through musical illusion. He was also an omnivore of culture. Disney World had become something of a platonic ideal of happiness for Chris. He would indulge in this obsession with feigned restraint, making pilgrimages there twice a year, regaling us with just enough detail to try to entice us down to Orlando. Disney World was a secret door to his inner glee, the source of the light that countered Mr. Sunshine's darkness. But when it came to actual dining, Chris was a man of habit. I lost count of the number of epic dinners we had at Fiorello's in Lincoln Center, each one at Chris's personal table, complete with movable plaque with Christopher Rouse embossed on it, ceremoniously brought out whenever he showed up, along with 4 black Russians that were de rigueur to order before appetizers. Chris would pretend to consider everything on the large menu, only to always settle on the enormous cheesy lasagna. Over these meals, we opined on a Rousean range of subjects: Juilliard politics, the most hilarious sitcom ever made, That's My Bush, our favorite student works, which we were as proud of as if we had written them ourselves. We mused on why Schoenberg had used the Wagner tuba only once in his Gurrlieder, and why not in any other piece. He needled me, as he loved to do, when his last-place Baltimore Orioles rallied to beat my Red Sox to keep them out of the wild card. It was at one of these meals that he told me he hoped his ashes could be spread out over Disney World after he passed. In the fall of 2019, I flew out to Cincinnati to attend the posthumous premiere of Chris's Sixth Symphony. His wife, Natasha, had stood devotedly and lovingly by his side through a long and trying last summer. Chris had actually told me several years before that he was done with composing, but I never believed him. I was sure he would go on, as he had, cranking out pieces every year like clockwork. But in that final summer, he completed his symphony. The subject of death, which had been such a preoccupation in so many of his works, had turned inward. In a chilling insert placed inside the program on the day of the premiere, Chris wrote, "At the end, the final step must be taken alone." Sitting by myself in that Cincinnati hall, half filled for the Friday afternoon matinee, I listened for the first time to a symphony by a composer whose work I would miss only less than his friendship. As the last movement unfolds, a descending zigzag tritone motif in the low flugelhorn intones beneath an icy sustained E pedal in the strings, which hangs suspended like a cloud. The pedal, inflecting the great divide of a cold, hollow octave, gradually begins to shift in search for a tonality, melting through a celestial A major passing half cadence, seeming to yearn for forgiveness, comfort. The questioning of the flugelhorn persists. The glacial E pedal does not yield. It was unimaginably beautiful. Did we just hear E major? Maybe. Yes. Perhaps for a moment. And then it was gone.
Thank you so much, Bob. A tribute to Robert Ryman will be read by Susan Dunne, formerly of the Pace Gallery, who worked closely with Robert Ryman for nearly 30 years. After her tribute, she will read a brief remembrance by artist and Academy member Sylvia Plimack Mangold.
Several years ago, over lunch, Richard Tuttle said to me, "The world is divided into 2 types of people, people with a ceiling and people without a ceiling." The more I thought about that and how it applied to the people I knew, the more one name kept recurring, Robert Ryman. Bob was the epitome of a person without a ceiling. For nearly 30 years, I watched him expand the boundaries of painting with a language all his own. He knew no limits because he never imposed any on himself, and he never stopped taking risks, incorporating such common materials as wax paper, Scotch tape, staples, nails, screws, and bolts into his art, all the while forcing us to change and refine the way we look at a painting. Every 2 years or so, Bob would phone and invite me to his studio on Greenwich Street, saying there were new paintings to see. I came to think of these calls as wake-up calls, for they meant that Bob had turned a corner, and he never failed to come up with fresh and exciting creations. When I got to the studio, the paintings would have already been carefully installed by him, and Bob would be wearing a suit and a dress shirt. He was very meticulous about how his work is presented. For every exhibition we made together over the years, we would spend 2 days hanging the paintings and the next 3 lighting the show. For one exhibition in the 90s, Bob included 3 paintings that at first glance seemed nearly identical. Before Bob was a painter, he had been a jazz musician, and now he explained to me that he had approached these canvases as he would a musical score, trying to play it exactly the same way 3 times in a row. Inevitably, of course, subtle differences had started to appear in the 3 works until each emerged as a unique and individual piece. Bob took great care with the titles he gave his works. Mostly he chose them for their non-associative names. Before an exhibition in 2004, he told me with a wry smile that he was going to call the new group White Paintings. We both laughed because by then the world had identified him as the artist who always made white paintings. But he grew quite serious as he explained to me that though in the past he had used white, this was the first time he had actually painted white. He had made it another important discovery and brought fresh vision to his work yet again. Year after year, I noticed that one painting never left Bob's studio. It was hung up high on a wall out of the way, but it was always there. I finally felt compelled to ask him about it. That's either the best painting or the worst painting I've ever made, he said. I thought that if I had to look at it every day, one day I'd know which it was. In a similar vein, I once overheard him give advice to a young painter who wanted to know how Bob kept going, how he kept going year after year, how he kept finding new inspiration. Bob told him, you just go to the studio every morning and clean it. Keep turning up day after day, and one day you will know where you're going. The only thing that was more important to Bob than painting was his family. To his considerable delight, all 3 of his sons became artists whose work he respected. Once when I mentioned that I was going to visit the studio of one of his sons, Bob said with a pleased smile, you are going to be really surprised. About another one, he told me, I think he has struck a chord at this moment. About a 3rd son, he once said, he is a real artist. Meryl, Bob's wife of more than 50 years, is an esteemed artist in her own right. Whenever she entered a room, Bob would look at her with the pride and tenderness of a young man out on his first date. Every Easter and Thanksgiving, the Rymans threw open their doors with all of the dogs and parrot and cats to a large extended family of their friends. This became such a tradition that for several weeks leading up to the 2 holidays, these friends only had to say with one another, will I be seeing you at 16th Street? The moniker given to their home. I was happy that Bob came several times to the retrospective exhibition of his drawings I made a couple of years ago. Over more than 4 decades, he produced these wonderful images on everything from canvas to metal to coffee filters. After looking over the show carefully, Bob smiled and said, these are really very good drawings. Very interesting. They're amazing. In the book Mortals and Others, Bertrand Russell gives a formula for living that reminds me very much of my friend without a ceiling. Russell writes, ignore fact and reason, live entirely in the world of your own fantastic myth-producing passions. Do this wholeheartedly and with conviction, and you will become one of the prophets of your age. Now I have the great honor of reading Academy member Sylvia Plimack Mangold's Remembrance to Bob. I'm grateful to Bob Ryman for influencing and challenging my ideas on how an artist goes about organizing their work. such as where their boundaries and choices come from. I chose to look at my surroundings because they enabled me to focus and access a part of my mind that takes me someplace besides the reality I'm looking at. So when I look at Bob Ryman's art, I see order and limitations that inspire ideas I don't normally think about. And then there is his personality, which is quiet. One often had to imagine what he was thinking in the times I saw him, which was usually in a group. Bob Mangold and I saw a lot of Bob Ryman in the early 1960s because we lived near our Bowery studio, which was in the same building that the Rymans lived and worked in. No one had any money to spend except for basic needs, which included art and rent. Bob Ryman liked to cook. He was cautious and very careful. He loved his family and his pets, and he was a very disciplined and able craftsman whose art is truly memorable. In those years, some of our artist friends had shows, while Bob Ryman, who was older, could not find a gallery interested in his work. Interest came when the art world figured out a context for his paintings, but I don't think that really explained the work, it just validated it. And then suddenly Bob Ryman became the most influential painter we knew. I think it is this mysterious success that he experienced in his midlife that speaks to what it means to be an artist in a commercial culture. I don't know how to explain his art except that it is engaging and contemplative. It draws you in and you see the relationship he has painted and organized in a way that is unlike anything we knew.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Sylvia. These evenings are really so amazing because each speaker writing and speaking with so much warmth and sometimes humor and love, you all perform the miracle of bringing the person that you're speaking about back to life. We hope that you will join us all for the next reading at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, June 16th, 2021. Until then, I wish you well. Good night.